I'm Kris Gardner of the Houston Round Ball Review, local name, global perspective. Joining me right now is Justin Williams, the Cincinnati Bearcats beat writer for The Athletic. Long time no see, man. How are you?
I'm all right, Kris. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well. Let's get into it. Well, I'm going to put you on the spot real quick, man, if you don't mind. Do you have any Big 12 money deal announced that it's official yet to disclose?
I got nothing. I think everything that's been out there recently, I think is pretty accurate from what I can tell. That they're working on it. The term amicable keeps getting thrown around. I feel like that's only a word you really use when maybe it's on the precipice of not being amicable.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it'll be interesting because the conference seemed to kind of put themselves in an interesting spot with that UConn deal a couple years ago. And from the conference perspective, I totally get why this is a different deal, different situation for them. But from, Cincinnati, Houston, UCF's perspective, I understand why they're pointing at that and being like, all right, here's a precedent. So my guess is kind of the same other people have been saying. I'll be shocked if all three of those teams aren't playing in the Big 12, by next season, 2023 football season. But it's clearly some still things they need to get hammered out.
You're right on point, man. That was my thing that I hammered out in the shows here, that the UConn deal was a precedent. And I encouraged UH, Cincinnati, UCF to stick with that precedent that the conference did with UConn. When they tossed out $45 million, that wasn't what UConn had to pay, and they gave less notice.
Right.
Than these three schools. So let's deal with some on-court and then on-field stuff as well. Coach Wes Miller got good news with I think a 4-star young man from Cincinnati committing to the Bearcats. Talk about him.
Yeah, Rayvon Griffith. He's a local Cincinnati kid, 4-star, top 50 kid in the 2023 class. So if everything goes to plan, he'd be coming in with that first kind of Big 12 class going, for Cincinnati, and that's a huge get. Football and basketball in Ohio and Cincinnati are a little bit different. Like Luke Fickell, has kind of made a name on the football side of getting those local kids to stay home and recruit in the state of Ohio. It's not quite the same in Cincinnati and Ohio on the basketball side, but when you have a kid like Rayvon Griffith come through, who's a big name, who has, his top 5 was Cincinnati, Ohio State, Alabama, UCLA, Kansas. Like those are big names. So when you can get a local kid like that to stay home, and kind of be that hometown hero when they do pop up in the Cincinnati area, that's a big deal. Going back about over a decade now, Mick Cronin got Yancey Gates to stay home. Kind of a similar situation. 4-star kid. Mick Cronin was early in his tenure. It made a big deal. It was a big impact on the floor, but also just kind of with the excitement and energy of the program and in the community. So, it'll be a while before Rayvon steps on the floor for Cincinnati, but that's already a big win for Wes Miller.
And I think you got some quotes from Rayvon. Did he touch on how important, if at all, I'm assuming it was, that the move to the Big 12 kind of helped him choose the Bearcats?
Yeah, it'd be interesting. Would he have come otherwise? I don't know. Fortunately for Cincinnati, they don't have to worry about that. And yeah, I definitely think it had an impact. He's looking at Kansas, who just won a national championship in the same conference as kind of one of the other teams on his finalist list. Well, you get to come and play against Kansas and, at Cincinnati. So yeah, I think it makes a big difference. I'm sure you're seeing the same thing at Houston. It makes a difference with all these recruits, right? Like football, basketball, transfers, high school kids. Like I know Cincinnati's selling it hard to all of them. And it certainly has an impact.
Question for you. Has UC advertised Big 12 around campus?
They have. There's like a kind of a big, not a billboard. It's probably smaller than that, but kind of a big like billboardish sign on campus, kind of right in the middle of their Varsity Village athletics area that sporting the Big 12 symbol. And they actually, I think they probably ran into a little bit of angst early in the football season when they ran out of Big 12 kind of shortly after the announcement. I don't think the AAC was too happy about them.
I remember
doing
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We haven't seen that Big 12 flag since then. But so they've definitely, done it, but, they are for sure doing it in all of their messaging, whether it's to, recruits, graphics, or just kind of putting out ticket, information, stuff like that. The Big 12 logo is always prominent. And it's something they're always talking up. So they're playing it up as much as they can for sure.
Yeah, because UH put on the athletic alumni building the Big 12 symbol, big bold letters, from top to bottom, like top of the building to the ground. I was like, okay. So here we are with that. So I'm sure Mr. Resco was not thrilled with that either.
Right.
But how would you define or grade the first year of basketball under Coach Wes Miller?
That's a good question. I think I might have even written this. I think you could call it incomplete, for a few reasons. One, he came in, after the coaching transition. I think it was about mid-April when he got hired. By this point last year, he's still trying to get his roster together and get his staff in place, all that kind of stuff. So you're working on a shortened off season. And, I think he tried to do his best with what he had, but he's basically trying to imprint his culture and his system on, a roster that he brought in some guys from UNCG with him. He was able to add some guys via the portal when he got here, kept some from, the existing roster at Cincinnati. So you're kind of trying to piece it together while also then putting your culture and your system in place. And that's a challenge. And that's a challenge that every new head coach encounters, whether they're, hired up to a new level or, taken over after someone gets fired, or whatever. So he understood that and he knew that was going to be the case. But I think a lot of times in practice, that's a lot more challenging than maybe you give it credit for. And so I think, they played pretty well to start the season. They beat Illinois, at one of their MTEs early in the year and then played really well with Arkansas, the next night and ended up losing by just a few points. And I think at that point, everyone was like, all right, maybe this team's going to be a little bit ahead of schedule. And then as the season wears on and kind of the attrition of league play kicks in, you started to see some of their deficiencies. They played really well defensively to start the season. That tailed off as the year went on. They really struggled all year offensively. Just they didn't have enough, creators, shot makers. And so what I think you noticed is Wes Miller taking, all right, here are some things we did well. Probably more so, here are some things we didn't do well in my first year. How do we improve on that? How do we correct those? And I think you've seen so far this off season, kind of his first true full off season, the way he's going about that with the transfer portal, with some of the roster overhaul, and even, like getting somebody like Rayvon Griffith for 2023. So yeah, if you're giving it a grade, I think you could call it incomplete. I think you could call it, kind of a C. There were moments of positive notes and encouraging moments, and then there was a lot that they need to improve on. But I think if you're a Cincinnati fan, what you have to be encouraged by is that Wes Miller has kind of addressed those and recognized those, and he's trying to correct those going into year two.
And one of the reasons I like speaking with beat writers from around the conference is to get their perspective on UH, but as a conference as a whole. I remember after the Bearcats Houston game at Fifth Third Arena, Coach Miller was very candid about, I guess, the talent gap or effort gap, whatever you want to say, between Houston and Cincinnati. Were you surprised at how blunt he was after that game?
No, because that's kind of his style. He's really been that way since he showed up, and from a media perspective, that's refreshing.
Sure.
I don't think any coach is ever 100% honest in those press conferences, but whatever percentage Wes Miller is, it's I think higher than a lot of coaches. And I hope it stays that way. But no, it's also like you can't really lie about it when you see what Houston's done to Cincinnati on the floor the past couple of years. And look, the other thing too is fans, other teams, they know it too, because they know what Cincinnati was a few years ago when Mick Cronin and Kelvin Sampson's squads were, battling it out for conference titles. And so you can see what happens. There's a lot, I guess there's probably a greater appreciation for kind of the culture that Mick Cronin built at Cincinnati, because you see when it changes. All right, so Cincinnati had a coaching change. Houston keeps going. They go to a Final Four. They go to an Elite Eight. They're going to the Big 12. Kelvin Sampson's really kind of just continuing to build on his culture. Well, when you start over a couple times at Cincinnati, which they've had to do now, you see how much, that can kind of slip you behind a team like Houston. So yeah, Houston is clearly, at least as long as they're in the AAC, they're the top dog, right? That's who everyone's going after. And I think Wes Miller recognizes that, and he's not going to shy away from trying to get back to that point.
And one thing Coach Kelvin Sampson has said a few times to us, and I think conference media as well, is the Bearcats under Coach Cronin, first early years of the AAC, they were the flagship of the conference, and Houston aspired to be where the Bearcats are. And now Houston is the flagship of the AAC. Mm-hmm. And now everybody else is trying to get to their level. So it goes in cycles, it goes in shifts. Have you given much thought to what we as media are going to see basketball wise in the Big 12?
Oh yeah, I'm excited for it.
Oh, no question.
I don't know how much like Kelvin Sampson and Wes Miller are really excited for it when they sit down and see, the schedule, and they got Texas Tech and Kansas and whoever, coming back-to-back nights or something like that. But no, I mean, the fans are thinking the same thing. It's certainly, it's going to be a transition. At least right now, Houston basketball-wise is in a better position than Cincinnati, I think, to make that leap. But look, it's been the best basketball conference, the past couple of years now. They've had, the last two national championship winners in Baylor and Kansas. Mm-hmm. And if you look at kind of the metrics of adding these new teams, it'll probably still be the best conference when Houston, Cincinnati, UCF, BYU join in a couple of years. So as a beat writer, I'm definitely excited I've heard some of these Big 12 cities are a little tough to get to, so I'm maybe not excited about some of the travel, but yeah, looking down the conference schedule and seeing the teams that are coming to town every night, whether you're a fan or a media member, I think that should be a lot of fun.
And to go back to the AAC, have you been surprised at how few teams have advanced to the NCAA tournament the last couple of years from the conference?
Maybe a little bit, but it's just like, I guess seeing what's happened at Cincinnati, I can kind of understand it a little bit because, all right, if you're just kind of looking on the surface, okay, Houston, Memphis, Cincinnati, like those should be your teams that are getting in every year if you're kind of just going on, even recent history. Well, Memphis is, they've had their ups and downs, obviously, under Penny, and they were finally able to make it this year. And I think you saw what that talent could do if it gets there. And then Cincinnati, they went to 9 straight NCAA tournaments. So it was almost like a foregone conclusion. Then you have some coaching changes and you realize how easy it is to slip off. Say the same about Wichita State, right? Like they kind of had it rolling, then they have a little bit of a coaching change and that causes some upheaval. So there's those teams like SMU that seem to kind of be right there, on the bubble every year. But when you have teams like Wichita and Cincinnati and Memphis who are expected to make it and then maybe have some struggles or some dips, you pretty easily can go from like 3 to 4 team conference to a 1 to 2 team conference there pretty quick.
How do I phrase this? I think Commissioner Resco said during the basketball conference championship that the plan was not to have an in-person basketball media day in October. But he will have one in person for the new 6 that join, assuming next year. Have you been kind of surprised that the lack of in-person media day activity from the conference this year and last year?
Yeah, I don't know. It's tough because there's obviously, you factor in all the stuff going on with the pandemic still. Maybe people could still point to that as being a reason. But then I also think it's just like, which is why I think all this Big 12, changeover stuff has to get done because that's what's hanging over everything. And it'll be best for everyone, once everyone joins their new conferences and moves on. And if the American is kind of saying like, yeah, we'll worry about getting back together when that change happens. Okay, that makes sense, but it's also just one of those things then, all right, both sides need to work together to get this finalized because clearly, look at what we've talked about. These schools that are getting ready to move, they're ready to move on. That's what they want to get to. And I'm sure the American, as much as it's going to change things for them, like they want to bring in these new members that want to be there and kind of get moving in that direction.
Where do you see college athletics where do you see the Big 12 in 5 years? Will they be closer to the Big 2, the Super 2, as the Big 10 and SEC, or will they be further behind the ACC and the Pac-12?
That's a good question. I think they'll start to be that kind of divide of like SEC, Big 10. and then maybe those next three conferences kind of falling then in behind them a little bit, but then still a big gap between everyone else. But it'll be interesting because money-wise, it'll be obvious, right? Like there'll be some pretty clear differences in terms of whatever these next TV deals are. But I'm curious how soon and to what degree the maybe talent on field, on court performance level is impacted. You can certainly make the case in college football that like the SEC has already done that. But in basketball, it's, it's not quite as glaring for a whole host of reasons. So I'm interested to see 5 years from now. Yeah, we know the money's probably going to be pretty different, but what does it look like performance wise? Cause I think it'll be interesting to see, like, do those two top conferences, do they really pull away, or is it just a football thing? I don't know. So I think that'll be something interesting to track.
I want to ask you some questions about Coach Fickell and football in a second, but your thoughts on the women's basketball at Cincinnati? Have they been disappointing?
That's probably fair, or just, I think when Michelle Clark-Heard came in, there was a lot of excitement. I think that first year they went to the NIT and kind of made a little bit of noise, made a little bit of a run there, and they maybe haven't quite gotten back to that same level. And again, there's a whole bunch of factors. You're playing through the pandemic and, her next couple seasons and all that kind of stuff. But I think there was a lot of excitement and encouragement from her first season, and maybe they've fallen a little bit short of those expectations. So, I think she's come in and done a lot in terms of recruiting and kind of raising the profile of the program, and that's all good. But it's same deal as everything else, right? They're going to be in the Big 12 too. Yeah. And so, you would really hope that you can start to elevate this season, your last one in the AAC, and maybe get some good momentum going in the Big 12.
Going back, I just remembered to ask you this. How has Coach Miller done in the portal this offseason for men's hoops?
Yeah, I think they've made some good moves. The most notable one, familiar name, is Landers Nolley, who played at Memphis past 2 seasons. He's coming in, and honestly, might come in and be their best player next season, or certainly one of their 2 best players. So that's a big get. He fits exactly kind of what they need and what Wes Miller wants to do from a style standpoint. And then they brought in 2 other guys, Kalua Zikpe from Old Dominion, a big man, and Rob Finnessy from Indiana, point guard, like filled 2 areas of needs. But also, those are 4-year guys they're bringing in. Same with Landers Nolley. They're bringing in some adults. They're bringing in some grown men who, Zikpe, I guess, was doing it at ODU, that would be a step up. But the other 2 guys, Landers was at Memphis and at Virginia Tech before that. Finnessy was at Indiana. They've been through some battles and some tough conferences. And so I think that's part of what they needed. They fit in terms of style and what their strengths are on the floor, but they also, just from a mentality, kind of maturity approach, is kind of, they bring something that Cincinnati is going to need on the floor as well. So I think Wes Miller did, at least on paper, did really well to kind of fortify the roster.
Will Landers have to request a waiver?
That's a good question. As I understand it, he will not, because assuming he graduates from Memphis, there's still like a grad transfer waiver you have to get, but as I understand it, it's almost like an automatic thing. So as long as he graduates and as long as he, whatever his major that he declares at Cincinnati fits all the requirements, that would get signed off. So it wouldn't be a traditional like second transfer for waiver. Assuming again that he graduates, which from everything I've heard is obviously the plan.
All right, let's talk some Bearcats football. I think I saw Coach Fickell once again doing a great job in the recruiting rankings. But what's your assessment of how he's done for this class and then Big 12 ready class?
Yeah, no, I think 22. The kind of class they come having in this year, that they've done a good job. They've added a couple 4-star defenders, an edge rusher out of Florida, a cornerback out of Alabama. Guys that, let's be honest, they wouldn't have had access to a couple years ago. And you can start saying the same thing when you're looking at the 2023 class. And I've talked about this. There was really 3 things that were used against Cincinnati on the recruiting trail. One is Luke Fickell's never going to stay there. Like when other teams were recruiting against Cincinnati, Luke Fickell's going to leave. The other one is, they play in the AAC. It's not a power conference. And then the third one is they're never going to compete for a championship, make a playoff. Well, Luke Fickell's locked up through 2028, making $5 million a year. they're going to the Big 12 and they just went to the playoff. So like those, they were doing pretty well even with those kind of barriers or the things people were using against them. And I think you're starting to see in the type of player they're going after and in the type of player they're getting commitments from, like, all right, now those barriers are kind of been knocked down and, they're definitely taking some big swings and they're getting, prospects who are a lot more receptive to it because they've seen what Cincinnati's done on the field and also see where they're going.
How much of a drop off in football, because they're losing a lot of talent, but how much do you foresee for this team this season, this fall?
That's the big question. And that's what, everyone here is talking about. I'm sure it's what everyone in the conference is talking about. Houston obviously had a really good year last year, but it was pretty clear coming into last season, like Cincinnati was kind of the team to go after. They went to the New Year's Six Bowl the year before, undefeated regular season. It was, they're at the top. Can they stay at the top last season? I don't think it's quite that this year. I think the overall sentiment is probably like, well, Houston brings back a little bit more. And they were in the championship last season, so maybe Houston's the top, or like can Cincinnati still compete with Houston with all the talent that they've lost? And so that'll be really interesting to see. I think I still kind of view it as like it'll be Cincinnati and Houston going for the championship, but whereas last year it was Cincinnati was kind of the clear one that everyone's going after. I don't think there's that huge gap with Houston on top, but I think it's fair to say, all right, Houston might be in the driver's seat this year, but can Cincinnati compete for it again? And from Cincinnati's perspective, if they can do that, if they can win a third straight AAC championship with all that they just lost from the playoff team last year, I don't want to say it's as impressive as making the playoff last year, but like it kind of shows just the strength of this program if they're able to do that. Compete for another championship, maybe go to another New Year's Six Bowl, losing 9 NFL draft picks. Like that's kind of unprecedented from Cincinnati's perspective, and I think would speak a lot to what Luke Fickell's built.
When is conference football media day? Is it next month or July?
It's usually July. It's usually kind of like mid-July. I don't know if they've set a date.
Are you
exactly
planning to make that trip? I think they're going to be for that. I think
if we're invited, you never know with the way this is all going. But yeah, I'd have to look at schedule wise. But I would hope that I'd be able to make it out there if they said it. Are they doing it? Is it in Dallas now? Do you know? Because traditionally they went out to Rhode Island.
I think it's going back to Rhode Island. I think.
Really? All right.
I think so. I want to say because I think I asked Commissioner Resco about the media days, football and basketball, and I want to say in that answer he said they will have one in person, and I want to say back at Rhode Island for football. I think.
Interesting.
I'll have to ask about that. I mean, it's kind of strange, but it was such a big hit because of the food and the atmosphere and the whole vibe. But
right.
Who knows about that? But we'll see. Justin Williams, football assessment for the conference as a whole. How many bowl eligible teams do you think the AAC will produce this year?
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, so what do we know? What we had off the top of your head? Do you know what they had last year?
I don't. And I should have thought about that before I asked you the question.
No, I don't know either off the top of my head, but I think you got to think like at least half the league should be getting bowl eligible. They're playing 4 non-conference games. I realize, for a lot of those, they're playing a power conference team in there, but for a team like Cincinnati and Houston, that hasn't been a, deterrent for a win. And yeah, going down the list, I think there's some teams who have kind of been improving, slowly but surely over the past couple of years. So without looking at schedules and all that kind of stuff, it feels like they should get around 6, I would think.
Wrap it up. Going back to basketball, what is your assessment, and if you can, Coach Miller's assessment of the job Kelvin Sampson has done at Houston?
I mean, for my assessment, like we do, internal at the Athletic, like voting for Player of the Year, Coach of the Year. I voted Kelvin Sampson Coach of the Year, and I think for a lot of people, they didn't realize, maybe until you got to the NCAA tournament, like what Sasser and Mark were supposed to mean that to that team. Sasser, especially, like, he was supposed to be preseason Player of the Year.
Yeah.
He goes down, misses all of conference play, and they still, basically without 2 key players, make an Elite 8 run. Like, that's tough to do, no matter what conference you're in. So for me, like, he's clearly, the best coach in the conference right now. And I voted for him for coach of the year last year. And, I don't want to speak for Wes Miller, but I bet he'd probably say something pretty similar. Like, it's hard to deny what Kelvin Sampson has built there. And if you look at what they've added via the portal and recruiting wise, like what they're continuing to build moving into the Big 12. And, for a long time, like you said, Cincinnati was kind of right at the top there. They were the bellwether of the conference. Like, it is very clearly Houston. They went to a Final Four. They lost some guys. They had some injuries. They went back to an Elite Eight. Like, you're at the top. And so I think that's what everyone in the conference is striving for. And to Wes Miller's credit, like, he doesn't shy away from that. He doesn't downplay that. But I know that's what he's working to get Cincinnati back is to kind of be on that same level.
Thanks, Justin. I know Coach Kelvin speaks highly of Coach Miller, and I think Coach Miller and Kellen go back a ways. So there's mutual respect in the programs there. And that's one thing that beat writers have. We just cover the teams and have respect for everybody in the conference. The fans they make up hate and all kinds of stuff, whatever. But I really appreciate you taking time to talk to me. I'm glad we got it done. If you hear any breaking news about when it's going to happen about the official Big 12 announcement, let me know. Or I'll just follow you on Twitter or whatever. Thank you very much, Justin Williams, Cincinnati Bearcats beat writer for The Athletic, man. You take care.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate you.
Anytime. Bye-bye.